Okay, so you're ready to dive deep.
Always ready.
That's what we like to hear. Today we're looking at The Kingdom Strikes Back by missiologist Ralph D. Winter.
A pretty fascinating interpretation of history. He looks at like 4,000
Yeah.
years, right?
4 millennia. And not just like random events, but as one big story unfolding over time.
Right, and there's a central conflict driving this story, this intervention of God's kingdom.
In a world that often, well, appears to be dominated by something, well, Winter calls it the evil one.
And I think that's a good place to start, right? We've
Yep.
got this battle between good and evil playing out over millennia.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic framework, isn't it?
It is, it is. And Winter, he gives us this really interesting lens to view it through, dividing history into 10 distinct periods, epochs, he calls them.
5 before Christ and 5 after.
Exactly, and that's kind of what we're going to unpack today, right? How this long view of history, this really zoomed out perspective, can help us understand, the patterns we see.
Yeah, the patterns, the things that just seem to keep happening over and over again.
And the impact of certain forces,
Yeah.
forces that have been at play for centuries.
So what are some of the unexpected things we're going to find in this framework?
Well, we're going to see how God's blessing operates, and it's not always how you might think.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, we always hear about blessings in kind of a general sense.
Right, but Winter digs deeper, looks at the specifics, and it's pretty revealing.
Anything else?
Oh, yeah. We're going to see these recurring cycles of progress, then setbacks, then more progress.
Like a constant push and pull, almost.
Exactly. And then there are these key individuals and movements. They pop up at crucial points in history.
People you might not normally think of as being, well, world changers.
Exactly. But they have this outsized impact, and Winter highlights that really well.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you start to see history through this lens, isn't it? Have you ever thought of history as like one big story, Like one narrative with a plot, with a beginning, middle, and, well, who knows, maybe even an end.
It's a different way of looking at things, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it can be really illuminating. So where do we start with all this?
Well, Winter lays out the problem first. He starts with a pretty stark observation about humanity.
Yeah, he says our history is marked by, well, evil, war, and disease.
Like, consistently. And these destructive forces, they've been so powerful that, well, he says we've basically destroyed most of our own achievements over the centuries.
On lost libraries, vanished cities, you name it.
Over 90%, he says. It's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? And he uses paleological evidence to support this, like the study of ancient life.
And we're talking about really ancient, like, bashed-in skulls from early humans. I mean, violence, it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, it's like this ingrained capacity for destruction. It goes way, way back.
And to really illustrate this point about how destructive we can be, Winter makes a fascinating comparison. He says, look at the global population around the time of Abraham, 2000 BC. It was only like 27 million people.
27 million. Wow, that's tiny.
Right. I mean, that's less than the population of California, just California, the year 2000.
It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? I mean, population growth back then was a fraction of what we see today.
And Winter argues that this very slow growth, over thousands of years, is a direct result of constant war and disease.
It's like every time we take a step forward, something knocks us back.
Exactly. And he doesn't see these events as just random occurrences,
He attributes all this negativity, this constant cycle of destruction, to what he calls a rebellious and destructive evil.
A powerful force, a superhuman demonic person, if you will. And this concept, this idea of an evil one, it's really foundational to his whole framework.
It's like the dark side of the force, but on a global historical scale.
That's one way to put it, I guess. And he uses ancient texts to explain this concept, texts that are revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Like the Torah, the books of the law, the Torah.
Right. And they not only describe this source of evil, this evil one, but they also outline a counter-campaign.
A way to fight back, to push back against this darkness.
Exactly. And Winter says that the rest of the Bible, from Genesis 12 onward, is basically the story of this strike back of God's kingdom. It's not just a random collection of stories, but one continuous narrative of God reclaiming and restoring his creation.
It's like, imagine a giant tapestry. You see all these different threads, different colors, different patterns, but when you step back and look at the whole thing, you see this incredible picture emerging, this grand design.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the driving force behind this counter-campaign, this restoration, is God's blessing.
Okay, so we've got this big conflict, this evil force trying to dominate the world. And God's answer, his strategy, is to bless.
It might seem simple, but it's way more than just, good luck or something.
Yeah.
Winter explains that this blessing is like a bestowal of family name.
Like being adopted into God's family.
In a sense, yes. And with that comes responsibility, obligation, and yes, privilege.
It's not just about getting goodies.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The goal is to bring whole families, and often in this context, he's talking about nations, back to God, back into his household, back in a right relationship with him.
So it's a grand, sweeping plan, isn't it? This blessing is meant to spread, to extend outward, to draw more and more people in.
And it's a long-term plan. It doesn't happen overnight. It's this ongoing process of God working in the world, sometimes in very subtle ways.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. We mentioned those 5 epochs before Christ, right? The first one's in Winter's framework.
Right. The first one is the time of the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph.
These are the big names, the founding fathers, so to speak.
Exactly. And even way back then, we see that core instruction to bless the nations. It's right there in Genesis 12:1-3, and it gets repeated and echoed throughout the Old Testament.
It's like a recurring theme, the idea that God's blessing is meant to spread, to touch everyone, not just a select few.
And then we have Joseph.
Yeah.
He's a great example of how God's plan can work in unexpected ways. He gets sold into slavery, right?
Not exactly what you'd call a blessing in the traditional sense.
But through a series of events, he ends up saving Egypt from famine and becoming a powerful figure there.
So he unintentionally blesses a whole nation, even though he was, a slave.
Exactly. And then we move into the next 4 periods: the captivity, the judges, the kings, and the Babylonian exile.
A pretty long stretch of time. And it seems like, well, maybe the mission to spread God's rule kind of fades into the background during this time.
It might appear that way, but Winter argues that God was still working, using both voluntary and involuntary means. Think about Jonah, for example.
He really didn't want to go to Nineveh, did he?
Not at all. But he ends up going, preaches to the Ninevites, and they repent. It's this amazing example of involuntary outreach.
God using someone who was completely reluctant.
Right. And then you have Joseph in Egypt again. He didn't exactly volunteer to be sold into slavery, but God used that situation to bless a whole nation.
So we've got these 2 involuntary mechanisms, people going involuntarily and, people coming involuntarily.
Right. And then you have the voluntary ones, like Ruth. She chose to follow Naomi back to Israel. And then there's Naaman, the Syrian general, who was healed of leprosy by Elisha.
And the Queen of Sheba, she travels all the way to Jerusalem to hear Solomon's wisdom. So these are people who were drawn to God's relationship with Israel.
And Winter categorizes all of this into 4 mission mechanisms. People going voluntarily, people going involuntarily, people coming voluntarily, and people coming involuntarily. It's a helpful way to understand how God was reaching out, even during this time when it seemed like things were, maybe not going according to plan.
And throughout all of this, God is still working, even though his chosen people, the Israelites, they weren't always, living up to their end of the bargain.
Right. They weren't always embracing their role as the conduit of blessing to the world. And this leads us to a really pivotal moment, what Winter calls the incriminating visitation.
The arrival of Jesus. It's like the story takes a dramatic turn here.
It does. Jesus comes to his own people, but as John's gospel tells us, his own did not receive him.
There's this sense of rejection, of missed opportunity. And Winter highlights the reaction in Nazareth when Jesus talks about God's favor extending to the Gentiles.
It's in Luke chapter 4, verse 28. And they basically try to throw him off a cliff. They can't handle it.
They're furious. They can't imagine God's blessing going to anyone but them.
And this highlights a crucial failure. Israel was meant to be this conduit of blessing to the world. It's there in Exodus 19.5-6. In Psalm 67, in Isaiah 49.6. They were meant to receive God's blessing and then mediate it to the other nations.
Like be a channel for God's grace to flow through.
Exactly. And while there were certainly devout individuals who were making converts, the focus wasn't always on this broader goal of blessing all nations.
So the chosen people, the original vehicle for extending the blessing, they kind of faltered. They didn't fully embrace their role.
And this sets the stage for what Winter calls the transition.
A shift in how God's plan will play out.
Exactly. And Winter argues that Jesus, in a sense, took the primary responsibility for the Great Commission away from Israel and gave it to well, to everyone else. He grafted in what Paul calls the unnatural branches.
The Gentiles, us.
It's right there in Romans 11:13-24. It's a radical shift in perspective.
So even though Israel as a nation largely rejected their role, God's plan doesn't stop. It adapts. It finds a new way forward.
And Winter points out that even during this time, before this official transition, God's blessing was still touching people from all sorts of different backgrounds.
Canaanites, Egyptians, Romans.
He's emphasizing that God's plan is bigger than any one nation, any one people group.
Okay, so that brings us to the second half of Winter's framework, the 5 epochs after Christ. And this is where our source material really dives deep.
Right. And the first period, the first epoch after Christ, is what Winter calls winning the Romans. It covers the years from 0 to 400 AB.
And this is a period of rapid expansion for Christianity, isn't it?
It is. Winter calls it perhaps the most spectacular triumph of Christianity in history. I mean, within 200 years, Christianity goes from this tiny sect in a remote corner of the empire to the dominant religion of Rome.
That's incredible. How did that happen?
Well, Winter points to several key factors. One is Paul. He had this revolutionary understanding of the Christian faith. He saw that the essence of Christianity could exist apart from, well, from many Jewish customs.
He's talking about things like circumcision, dietary laws, observing certain festivals.
Right. Paul understood that the core of Christianity wasn't about those external things. It was about an inward transformation, a circumcision of the heart.
And this was a radical concept for the time. It meant that people from all different cultures could become Christians without having to adopt all the customs of Judaism.
Exactly. And Paul's missionary methods reflected this understanding. He wasn't trying to make everyone into a Jew. He was focused on planting churches, building communities of faith, regardless of their cultural background.
So he's not demanding cultural uniformity. He's allowing for diversity within the Christian movement.
And it's important to note that Paul wasn't working alone. He had a whole team of missionaries who were traveling with him, working with him.
It sounds like he had a pretty structured approach to missions, almost like a modern-day organization.
In some ways, yes.
Yeah.
And he seemed to operate with a degree of authority from the churches that sent him out. But he also gave a lot of autonomy to the churches he planted.
He wasn't micromanaging them from afar.
Right. And Winter also highlights the role of persecution in spreading Christianity. He calls it the involuntary go mechanism. When Christians were persecuted, they scattered, they fled to new areas, and in doing so, they took their faith with them.
Like those Arian Christians who were forced to flee, and they ended up playing a big role in the conversion of the Goths.
Exactly. And then there's the fact that Christianity was spreading along the trade routes of the Roman Empire. These routes connected vast distances, and they provided a natural pathway for the Christian message to travel.
So even without a centralized, coordinated missionary strategy, Christianity was spreading organically through these networks of trade and communication.
And one thing that Winter finds really intriguing is the potential early connection between Christianity and the Celts. You know, the province of Galatia, where Paul planted churches, was originally settled by Celtic tribes from Western Europe.
So these Galatian Celts, they might have had a predisposition to Christianity. They were already familiar with the concept of one God.
And Paul's message, with its emphasis on the inward transformation rather than outward rituals, could have resonated strongly with them.
So it's possible that Christianity reached Western Europe much earlier than we traditionally think, maybe even before it took hold in Rome itself.
It's a fascinating idea. And as the number of Christians within the Roman Empire grew, it began to have a real impact on the political landscape. By the early 4th century, there were so many Christians that it was becoming difficult to ignore them.
And this is where Constantine comes in, right?
Right. In 313 AD, he issues the Edict of Milan, which grants religious tolerance to Christians.
Finally, an end to the persecutions.
And Winter argues that this wasn't just a random act of kindness. Constantine was a shrewd politician. He saw that Christianity was a growing force, and he knew that it was in his best interest to make peace with them.
Some historians even argue that even if Constantine hadn't converted to Christianity, the empire would have eventually become Christian anyway. It was just too big of a movement to suppress.
And the Roman Empire was going through an identity crisis at the time. The old gods, the old ways, they weren't working anymore. Christianity, with its emphasis on love, forgiveness, and hope, offered something new, something appealing.
So Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. But this triumph, it wasn't all good news.
It wasn't. Because once Christianity became associated with the power and prestige of Rome, it also became a target for suspicion and persecution in areas outside the empire.
Places like Persia and Arabia.
Exactly. And this actually helped to create space for the rise of Islam later on.
Because Islam offered an alternative, a different way of understanding God, a way that wasn't tied to the Roman Empire.
And while some of the Germanic tribes had already encountered a form of Christianity, Arianism, they saw it as a threat to their own culture and identity,
So they resisted it.
until they realized that they could actually conquer Rome. Then, the mainstream forms of Christianity, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy became less threatening.
Because now they could embrace the cultural prestige of Rome without having to submit to Roman political rule.
Right, and one of the major consequences of this whole situation was the withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain. They needed those troops to defend the heart of the empire against the Goths.
And this left Britain vulnerable to invasion by pagan tribes from northern Europe, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Frisians.
And that's how you get the first Dark Age in Britain. It's a classic example of how progress in one area can lead to setbacks in another.
It's like a domino effect. So let's move on to period 2, winning the Barbarians. This covers the years from 400 to 800 AD.
And now the Goths, those Arian Christians we talked about, they've become a serious military threat to Rome.
And the situation is made even worse by the Huns, who are pushing the Goths westward, deeper into Roman territory.
It's like a giant wave of migration and conflict sweeping across Europe. And in the midst of all this chaos, the Western Roman Empire collapses.
And it's fascinating that these invading tribes, these so-called barbarians, they often showed a surprising amount of respect for Christian churches.
Winter attributes this to the earlier missionary work that had been done among them, even if it wasn't always intentional or well organized.
So it's like these seeds of faith had been planted, and they were bearing fruit even in the midst of this violence and upheaval.
And this raises a really interesting question. What if the Romans had made more of an effort to evangelize these tribes before they became a military threat? Could they have changed the course of history?
It's a thought-provoking question, and during this period, we see the emergence of several distinct Christian traditions. Arianism, the more orthodox Athanasian Christianity, the Celtic Christian tradition, and the Benedictine monastic movement.
These groups, they were like little islands of faith in a sea of chaos. They preserved the scriptures, they shared the gospel, and they provided a model for Christian living in a very difficult time.
They were the Jesus people of their era, as Winter calls them, and these Benedictine monasteries, they were popping up all over the place. By the time the Vikings came along, there were over 1,000 of them.
And these monasteries weren't just places of prayer and contemplation. They were centers of learning, they preserved Roman technology, they copied manuscripts, they even taught agriculture.
It's like they kept the flame of civilization burning during a very dark time, and they had this deep reverence for the Bible. They would sing the entire book of Psalms every week.
It was a way of immersing themselves in the Word, of letting it shape their lives.
Of course, there was also a lot of syncretism going on. People were mixing their old pagan beliefs with their new Christian faith.
It was a messy process, but it was how Christianity took root in these new cultures. And the monastic orders, they played a crucial role in all of this.
Winter even quotes a historian who says that monasticism was the single most important institutional event in the history of Christianity after Christ's original commission.
It's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but it shows how important these monasteries were. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the missionary activity during this period wasn't being driven by the established centers of the church, like Rome.
It was being driven by converts. Celtic and Anglo-Saxon Christians who were taking the gospel to other barbarian tribes.
So the center of gravity for Christianity was shifting northward, away from the Mediterranean and toward northern Europe.
And towards the end of this period, we see the rise of Charlemagne. He's this powerful king who unites much of Western Europe under his rule.
And he's a devout Christian, isn't he?
He is. He promotes Christianity throughout his empire, and he fosters what's called the Carolingian Renaissance. It's this period of renewed interest in learning and scholarship.
Charlemagne sponsored schools, he encouraged the copying of manuscripts, he brought scholars to his court. It was a real flowering of culture.
But just like Constantine before him, Charlemagne's efforts to promote Christianity also had some unintended consequences. There were a lot of people who became Christian in name only, without any real heart change.
And sometimes his use of force to spread Christianity actually backfired, like with the martyrdom of Boniface.
It's a reminder that you can't force people to believe.
They can't legislate faith.
Exactly. And Charlemagne, for all his strengths, he also made a critical mistake. He
Mm.
failed to effectively evangelize the Viking populations to his north.
And that's going to come back to haunt Europe in a big way.
It is. Because those Vikings, they're about to become a major force in European history, and not in a good way.
This brings us to period third, winning the Vikings, which covers the years from 800 to 1200 AD.
And the Vikings, they're unlike any enemy that Europe has faced before. They're fierce warriors, they're skilled seafarers, and they're completely pagan.
And their favorite targets, monasteries, those centers of learning and piety that had been so carefully built up over the previous centuries.
The Vikings, they were ruthless. They would raid monasteries, burn them to the ground, slaughter the monks, steal anything of value.
There's that famous line from the Anglican prayer book, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." It really captures the terror that people felt.
And it's interesting because it's like the Vikings are attacking the very heart of Christian civilization.
Like they're trying to extinguish the light of faith that had been spreading across Europe.
But once again, we see this amazing resilience in the Christian movement. The Vikings, they might have conquered territory, but they were ultimately conquered by the faith of their captives.
They were drawn to the very thing they were trying to destroy.
It happened over and over again. Christian monks who were enslaved, Christian women who were taken as wives or concubines, they shared their faith with the Vikings, and many of them converted.
It's a powerful reminder that God can work through even the most difficult circumstances. And it's interesting to note that the Vikings destroyed a lot of the ancient manuscripts that had been collected during the Carolingian Renaissance.
It was a huge loss. But thankfully, enough copies have been made and distributed to other parts of Europe that a complete loss was averted.
It's like God was preserving his word, even in the midst of this destruction.
And the Irish missionary movement, which had been so vibrant in the previous period, it kind of cooled off during this time.
Because of the Viking raids.
Right. It became too dangerous to travel. The Vikings were following the same routes that the Irish missionaries had used, but they were bringing destruction instead of the gospel.
But there were still some positive developments during this time, like Alfred the Great in England.
He was a remarkable king.
Yeah.
He fought off the Vikings. He promoted education. And he made the decision to create a Christian library in the Anglo-Saxon language.
So he's making the Bible accessible to ordinary people.
Exactly. And it's a decision that was probably hastened by the Viking threat.
Because they had destroyed so many of the Latin manuscripts.
Right. So in a way, the Viking invasions actually helped to advance the cause of Bible translation.
And eventually the Vikings themselves began to convert to Christianity. The Normans in France, the Danes in England, they all became part of the Christian world.
And some historians suggest that the very things that attracted the Vikings to Europe in the first place, the wealth and the luxury, those things were ultimately what led to their conversion.
Because they saw the fruit of Christian civilization, and they wanted to be a part of it.
Exactly. And during this time, we also see the emergence of the Cluny Reform movement within the Catholic Church. This was a major effort to address corruption and to restore spiritual vitality.
And it had a big impact, didn't it?
It did. It led to the establishment of monasteries that were more accountable, more focused on prayer and spiritual discipline. And these monasteries became centers of reform, not just within the church, but within society as a whole.
They were challenging the status quo.
They were. And they were influential. People like Gregory I, Hildebrand, who later became Pope Gregory VII, and Innocent III, they were all part of this reform movement.
And Innocent III, he's the one who authorizes the first mobile missionary orders, the friars.
Right. This is a big development. Because now you've got these groups of highly dedicated missionaries who are free to travel all over Europe, preaching the gospel, establishing new churches, and working for social reform.
So by the end of period third, Europe is largely Christianized, and the papacy is more powerful than ever before.
But the big question is, what about the rest of the world? What about those who have never heard the gospel?
That's the challenge that period 3 is going to address, winning the Muslims. It covers the years from 1200 to 1600 AD.
And that question mark in the title? It's very deliberate.
Because it's not clear whether Christianity was successful in winning the Muslims during this time.
It wasn't. In fact, this period is marked by one of the most tragic missteps in the history of the Christian movement: the Crusades.
These are a series of military campaigns aimed at retaking the Holy Land from Muslim control.
And Winter, he sees them as a massive and tragic misconstrual of Christian mission.
He argues that the Crusades were driven by a spirit of conquest and violence, a spirit that was more akin to the Vikings than to the teachings of Jesus.
And it's interesting because many of the leaders of the Crusades were actually descendants of Vikings who had settled in Europe.
So it's like this warrior spirit was passed down through generations.
And the Crusades, they had a devastating impact. They resulted in immense bloodshed. They created a deep rift between Christians and Muslims, and they actually hindered the spread of the gospel in the Middle East.
They gave Christianity a bad name.
They did. And it's a stain that has lasted for centuries.
And Winter contrasts this violent approach with the more peaceful methods advocated by people like Francis of Assisi and Raymond Lull.
They believed in reaching out to Muslims with love and understanding, with dialogue and persuasion, not with force.
But unfortunately, their voices were largely drowned out by the clamor for war.
And it's important to remember that at this time, European knowledge of Islam was very limited. The first complete Latin translation of the Quran didn't appear until the 12th century, and it wasn't widely available for several centuries after that.
So there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of fear, a lot of prejudice.
In the Crusades themselves, they actually contributed to the hardening of Muslim attitudes toward Christianity. They confirmed the worst fears that Muslims had about Christians.
So it's this tragic cycle of violence and misunderstanding. And it fits into this broader pattern that we've seen throughout history.
Right, a period of progress followed by a period of setbacks. And this period is no different.
We've had the Romans, the Barbarians, the Vikings, and now we have the Black Death.
The plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century. It killed millions of people, including many clergy and religious leaders.
It was a devastating blow to the church.
It was, and Winter suggests that it might have been a form of divine judgment.
Not on the people who died, but on those who had rejected the gospel message.
It's like God was saying, if you won't listen to my messengers, I'll take them away from you.
It's a sobering thought, but even in the midst of this devastation, God was still at work.
He was. And the Black Death, it actually helped to pave the way for a new era of reform.
It's like the old order was swept away and something new was beginning to emerge.
And this leads us to the end of this period, which is marked by some remarkable developments. The invention of the printing press, the age of European exploration, and the Protestant Reformation.
The world is changing rapidly.
It is. And the Reformation, it's more than just a religious movement. It's a cultural and intellectual earthquake.
It's about challenging authority. It's about returning to the Bible. It's about asserting individual conscience.
And Winter sees it as a major act of cultural decentralization. It's breaking the grip of the Roman Catholic Church and paving the way for greater diversity within Christianity.
And one common misconception is that the Reformation was just a Northern European phenomenon.
Right. But Winter points out that there were reform movements happening all over Europe, including in Italy, Spain, and France.
And the key difference between the Reformation in the North and the reform movements in the South was that the Northern reformers were rejecting the cultural dominance of Rome.
They wanted to express their faith in their own languages, in their own cultural contexts. And this was a direct challenge to the Roman Catholic Church, which had always insisted on the use of Latin and on the uniformity of religious practice.
It's like Paul all over again. He didn't insist that the Gentiles become Jewish. He allowed them to express their faith in their own cultural ways.
Exactly. And the Protestant reformers, they were doing the same thing. They were saying that you don't have to become Roman to be Christian.
But there's one major criticism that Winter levels against the Protestant movement.
And it's this. For almost 2 centuries, they largely neglected global missions.
They were so focused on their own internal debates, on their own theological disputes, that they didn't make much of an effort to reach out to the rest of the world.
And this is in stark contrast to the Catholic Church, which was sending missionaries all over the globe during this time.
Even the Dutch Protestants, who had a vast colonial empire, they didn't do much in terms of missions.
It's a surprising omission. And it brings us to the final period in Winter's framework, Period V, to the ends of the earth. This covers the years from 1600 to 2000 AD.
And this is the period of European colonialism, isn't it?
It is. By 1945, Western powers control over 99% of the non-Western world. It's an unprecedented level of global dominance.
But it doesn't last, does it?
It doesn't. The colonial empires begin to crumble after World War II. And by 1969, most of the former colonies have gained their independence.
It's a rapid and dramatic decline.
And Winter draws parallels to the decline of the Roman Empire and the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. He suggests that the West might be heading for a similar fate.
Not necessarily a collapse, but a decline in influence.
Right, and he attributes this decline to several factors. One is the weakening of spiritual vitality in the West.
It's like the West has lost its sense of purpose, its sense of mission.
And Winter offers this stark comparison. The Western world spends far more money on cosmetics than it does on foreign missions.
It's like we're more concerned with our outward appearance than with the state of our souls.
And yet, despite this bleak assessment, Winter also expresses hope. He believes that the Christian faith will endure, that it will continue to spread, even if the West declines.
He sees a pattern throughout history. When one center of Christianity falters, another one rises to take its place.
And he points out that the current level of Christian morality in the world, even if it's